Okay, welcome back to part two of our chapter 4 lecture, The Rise of Radical Islam. And just a quick summary of the topics that we have covered up to this point. So if you remember, we started off in part 1 talking about and defining fundamentalism. We discussed selective interpretation and of scripture and doctrine. We talked about the misinterpretation of symbolic words. We also went over the justification and use of violence as called by God. We discussed charismatic leadership, and we also discussed the Arab Revolution and Arab Spring. We talked a little bit about the historical roots of Islamic fundamentalism, and we finished up with Islamic ideologies. And then finally, at the end of part 1, we discussed Davidson's 5 assumptions as they relate to radicalism and fundamentalism. And now we want to talk about a couple of different groups that have kind of morphed or evolved out of a lot of the things that we've already discussed. So first would be the Wahhabi movement, or Wahhabinism. So among the more interesting movements in Islam is Wahhabism. And it is the official form of Islam practiced in Saudi Arabia and other countries along the Arabian Peninsula and elsewhere in the world. Now, Wahhabi Islam was articulated or brought forth by Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab, who is recognized as the first modern Islamic fundamentalist. And we learned a little bit about him in part 1. Now, al-Wahhab labeled all who disagreed with him as basically as heretics and apostates. And he justified the use of force and violence in imposing both his beliefs and his political authority over neighboring tribes as that desire or will of God. And these labels permitted him to declare a jihad, which he interpreted as a holy war on other Muslims perceived to not be practicing Islam as he had interpreted it. So, the central point of al-Wahhab's fundamentalism movement, if you will, would be that, it was absolutely, every tenet that was added to Islam after its establishment by the Prophet Muhammad was false and should be eliminated. So basically, he's kind of old school. So Wahhabinism adheres to this strict traditional Islamic law. And again, that central point, those believe that every tenet that was added after Muhammad's death is false. It's not true, because that's not the traditional Islamic law. So hopefully that kind of makes sense a little bit. Now let's talk about the beginning of the Muslim Brotherhood and of the Salafi movement. So the Muslim Brotherhood movement was a political religious movement beginning in Egypt in the 20th century. Its motivations and religious objectives were an ideological return to the 19th century militant Wahhabism, kind of that old thing, in order to create the Islamic State. And it was started by Hassan al-Banna in response to British colonization of Egypt, and in the 1940s, it became the most powerful Islamic movement in the world. And with over 500,000 members, it involved a complex network of businesses, schools, universities, and clinics in Egypt, The Muslim Brotherhood began to engage populations throughout the Middle East, places, Syria, Lebanon, and Saudi Arabia. And the Muslim Brotherhood organized its followers into a close-knit Islamic-orientated community designed to serve as the dynamic nucleus or that vanguard, if you remember that term, in transforming the broader society from within. And all members comprised tight, socio-religious organizations with a network of branches and cells, and members were trained and reinforced in their faith and commitment to that stricter, old school, Islamic orientated state and way of life. And in addition, just kind of one last note, today the FBI reports that the philosophical father of all militant Islamic groups, the Muslim Brotherhood, has in fact established cells in the American Islamic communities as well, predominantly among students. An example, the Muslim Brotherhood actually co-sponsored a convention in Phoenix, Arizona. So there are some of these groups here, of course, in the United States. And now I want to introduce you to Saeed Qutb. And he is basically he's been called the architect of radical Islam and the father of modern terrorism. And Qutb transformed the ideological beliefs of Hassan al-Banna and the Muslim Brotherhood into a revolutionary call to arms throughout the Middle East. He is remembered not only as a martyr of the Islamic revival, but also one of the greatest of all revolutionary philosophers. And he emerged as the voice of the Muslim Brotherhood in the 50s. He also, felt, the holy war. The jihad was the only way to establish or reestablish Islamic order. And therefore, when he was killed, he became a martyr. And he did have hundreds of different writings and books, etc. So, if you remember back in chapter 2, we discussed the complex history and development of Palestine, or the Palestinian resistance that gave way to several radical groups within the Palestinian Liberation Organization. So I want to talk about three different groups. So three groups formed from the Palestinian cause, claiming the liberation of Palestine is a religious mandate and a key to uniting all Arab countries into one Islamic state. And these three groups are the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or the PIJ, and the Palestinian Islamic Resistance Movement, or Hamas. So let's take a look at these three. So the Martyrs Brigade grew out of the Palestinian-Israeli struggle, aligning itself with the original principles of al-Fatah, that armed struggle against Israel was the only way to achieve a Palestinian state. And the group considered terrorist attacks and a number and the murder of Israeli citizens to be a legitimate means of accomplishing this goal, and believed that any Arab concession to Israel was in fact treason to that Palestinian clause. Now, the Martyrs Brigade started as a radical nationalist movement within al-Fatah, but soon became ideologically aligned with the radical Islamic thoughts expressed by Saeed Qutb and some other groups. And some of the earliest suicide bombings were reportedly conducted by this group against the Israeli military. Now, initially, their operations were targeted against military roadblocks and even those that lived within the West Bank area. However, the religious radicalization of its members, combined with an overwhelming nationalist cause, gave way to increased suicide bombings and even sniper attacks. And since 2002, the group has been responsible for some of the bloodiest attacks in Israel, attacking innocent citizens as they sit in cafes, wait for public transportation, go to synagogue, or even shop in some of the shops or malls and stores in the area. And here are some photos of this particular group. And next we have the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or the PIJ. So, formed by the Fathi Shaqaiqi, formed the PIJ in the Gaza Strip during the 1980s. And they also enlisted help from Hezbollah, which was a Shiite terrorist group. And they used, tactics such as suicide bombers to inflict mass casualties, etc. So this Palestinian Islamic Jihad, it's another primary jihadist group, one of the early terrorist groups to adopt a radical Islamic ideology that justified violence and as I said, suicide bombings as a means to liberate Palestine. And a couple of photos of this group. And then we have the Palestinian, a little bit more. So we talked about this, one of the early terrorist groups to adopt a radical Islamic ideology that justified violence and suicide bombings as a means to liberate Palestine. So we're still on the PIJ. And two men were important to forming this group. Again, it was Fathi Shaqaiqi, who was assassinated by Israeli forces in 1995, and Dr. Ramadan Abdallah Shahala, who took over. He was educated in England, but conducted activities in the United States during 95 through 2008, and he is actually on the FBI's most wanted list right now. And then finally, we have the Palestinian Islamic Resistance Movement, or Hamas. Now, this group is clearly the largest and most successful of the Islamic fundamentalist groups identified within the Palestinian movement. Expressing radical Islamic ideologies to justify the liberation of Palestine. And this group sprang from the Muslim Brotherhood in about 1986. They are extremely anti-Jewish. Now, the ideology of Hamas was first observed in its charter, reflecting the common theme for liberation of Palestine and support of all the Palestinian nationalist efforts. However, the document also expressed its belief that Palestine is an Islamic holy land, and therefore no part of it may be inhabited by Israel. So, with that being said, the charter is a strongly anti-Jewish type document with, bordering on, paranoia as it relates to those that might be Israeli. So a little bit more, they are definitely, they're focused and they want liberation of Palestine and the destruction of Israel. Their primary motive or modus operandi has been, suicide bombings against civilian Israelites. And one other note, Hamas won a majority of seats in the Palestinian parliament in 2007. Okay, so another kind of philosophy that we want to talk about is Salafism. Now, Salafism is an Islamic philosophy founded in the late 19th century by Muslim reformers such as Muhammad Abdu Jamal Afghani and Rashid Rida. Salafism comes from the word al-Saf, meaning companions of Muhammad. And Salaf means the first or the earliest. So just a couple of definitions. So, which in their movement actually is regarded as the first generation of believers who were in fact the companions of the Prophet Muhammad. And soon this group became corrupted and then blended with Wahhabinism. So that was the first generation. Okay. Now, the second generation of Salafism was extremely radicalized and gained influence in the 1990s. It embraces violence as their only means to return to the original message of Islam. And they also see jihad as a global war that knows no boundaries. And their main enemy is, in fact, the United States. Okay, so I skipped over it. I do have a video on ISIS because that's who we're going to talk about next. But if you want to know anything about ISIS, I have a quick video that you can watch. So now we're going to talk about the Islamic State. And then we should be pretty close to wrapping things up for today. So the Islamic State, or IS, represents the largest and most virulent strain of jihadist Salafism in the Middle East today. Now, Al-Qaeda in Iraq was established in 2004 by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi and was the primary precursor entity that became the current Islamic State. And al-Zarqawi changed the focus of the Iraqi war from fighting U.S. and coalition forces to actually a civil war between the Sunni and the Shiite. And here you can look at the this was as of July 16th, the Islamic State occupied areas. Now, many of the radical Sunni fighters loyal to Al-Qaeda fled to neighboring countries, and in particular Syria. And Syrian rebels soon realized that the goal of the Iraqi group was to establish a new Islamic State in Iraq, and also, and the Levant, which is ISIL. Now, the Levant is a geographic and cultural area on the eastern Mediterranean Sea, composed primarily of modern-day Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Israel. So this particular area here. So this area is the Levant that we're talking about. So that's a little bit about the Islamic State. And now I want to kind of, talk about the new caliphate. Okay. So in July 2014, the leader of ISIL, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, declared himself the caliph. Now remember, we should have learned these terms already, and announced the establishment of the new caliphate. And he changed the name of the group to Islamic State. And the idea of the caliphate was based on radical Islam, is an evolution of its ideology. The Islamic State believes it is the new Sunni caliphate in the modern world today. So a couple of different things, to talk about. And on page 111 in your textbook, it talks about some of the ruthless violence that came along with the Islamic State. So, it is good to note before we finish up that the Islamic State, is the most powerful, ruthless, basically horrific and well-funded terrorist group in recent history. And not only has IS managed to take and control significant areas of territory, it has also become a de facto state. Since their 2014 claim of establishing that new caliphate, IS has also unleashed an unprecedented and prolific social media recruiting drive that has enabled them to attract up to 30,000 foreign fighters from more than 100 countries. And a steady stream of fighters continues to enter Syria and Iraq on a daily basis, with some estimates placing their number at over 1,000 new recruits per month. So as the Islamic State has arisen, seemingly out of nowhere to become a powerful foe, the West has struggled to comprehend the ruthless violence observed within that particular movement. So it is important to understand that how brutal they are. So, I mean, they have, there's torture and beheadings. There's rape. There's female slaves. There's all different types of violence that this particular group incorporates, if you will. Okay, so we're going to finish up with two different things. We're going to hit Khomeiniism. We're going to talk about one other group, Hezbollah, and then we're going to wrap things up. So, what is Khomeiniism? Well, Khomeiniism is a fundamentalist movement in the Shiite tradition, brought on by the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, a conservative and radical cleric who led the 1979 Iranian Revolution, and he rose to supreme leader of the new Islamic Republic of Iran, and their Sharia law was strictly enforced. Now he died in 1989, and again, he believed that secular states lead to marginalization and the destruction of Islam, and he basically wanted government and religion to unite together. And you've seen that in other groups that we've kind of talked about. And then finally, Hezbollah. So similar to, other ideologies, Khomeini's radical philosophies of strict enforcement of Sharia law and the continuation of a world Islamic revolution didn't die with him. Several of his edicts still permeate the Iranian government and their way of life. However, the most visible of Khomeini's followers, are observed in Lebanon, a small country adjacent to the north of Israel, having a relatively large population of Shiite Muslims, nearly 1/3 of the total population. So now we're going to talk a little bit about Hezbollah. It is a paramilitary organization headed by Hassan Nasrallah, developed by conservative Lebanese Shiite clerics, and they want Islamic unity, the destruction of Israel, and expulsion of Western powers from the Middle East. So similar to actually several of the groups that we've kind of talked about. They are backed by Iran and involved in both Lebanese and Syrian politics, and they are indeed a threat to Middle Eastern countries that are predominantly Sunni, because remember, this particular group follows the Shiite way of life and not the Sunni. Okay, that was a lot to cover, a ton of definitions. Thanks for hanging in there with me. So this is going to conclude part 2 of Chapter 4, our discussion on the rise of radical Islam. I know I covered everything quickly, but don't forget to review your key terms that are in the chapter. Don't forget to do the matching exercise of the key terms and the definitions. And then, of course, to read the corresponding chapter in your textbook to help you kind of add context to what we've been talking about today. So again, this concludes part 2 of our chapter 4 lecture on the rise of radical Islam.